Kinesiology 223, Chapter 8, still continuing with diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is book presentation 2. This presentation will focus on cultural competence, bias, as well as cultural sport psychology. So let's jump in without further ado. When you work with and coach people from different cultures, you have to be cognizant and be aware of the people you're working with. And you have to have what's called cultural competency. And to that end, you have to understand that, differences do exist, and different people on your team will have different cultural norms and morals and mores that they've grown up with. And as a result, whether it's from a different part of our country or they're from an entirely different country, you might have situations between you and one of your athletes, or even in between your athletes, where you just might not be able to understand where the disconnect is between you and your athletes. Now, you can get angry about this and get upset, and you can have your athletes get angry and upset in the practice environment, or as a coach or leader, you just might be called into some type of advocacy and be able to negotiate that conversation back and forth and say, person A wants this, person B is trying to say that, person A and person B don't quite understand what they're saying to each other. But, you have to be able to advocate for others. Now, when you're talking about cultural competency, it's this kind of awareness of the cultural differences. And sometimes within that context, you may be called to action to advocate for other people, whether it's advocating and mediating between two people, or it's advocating on somebody else's behalf. You just got to take a moment to kind of think through a time when, you had to advocate on behalf of somebody else, or maybe even a time when somebody advocated for you. For that to happen, for you to, for example, to advocate on behalf of somebody else, you first have to understand that what the cultural norms are and what is and what is not appropriate, and be able to recognize that in the moment, and be able to be courageous enough to act upon it. So if you ever find yourself in that situation, realize it's real easy just to knee jerk to say, man, that's wrong, you shouldn't be saying that to that person. But many times people just let that slide and they don't even intervene, say, hey man, that's a little bit inappropriate. But it's in some regard appropriate to tell somebody they're being inappropriate. Now the book lists 3 components to cultural competence, right? And it's a cultural awareness, you have to have cultural knowledge and some skills as well. And I agree with all of these, don't get me wrong. And when you look at this process, we have to also understand that there's bias involved. It's kind of like we all have bias built in. And that's like the first step to owning up and really getting kind of bought into the process of diversity, equity, and inclusion, is that we all have biases built in, whether it's from how we were raised or how we were made. But it's really rooted in the simple fact that, we're all a little different, and sometimes looking at somebody who's different from us might cause us to have any number of responses. And sure, they might not be logical. Sure, they might be something that you can't really explain why you have a belief or concern about somebody who is approaching you. And they might be nonsensical, but for you to become more highly evolved as a coach or a leader, you have to kind of drill down into these and go, where do these come from? Where is this behavior coming from? Why do I have this bias? And you start to really do this self-work to help maybe marginalize, reduce, or even eliminate these biases for other people or other populations. And that's really the first step, right? And then you become better at not having bias, and you still have, I'm sure you'll have a certain degree of it, as we all do as we go through our lives, but no, you really try to work on and evolve your skill set as a person to minimize those biases. So, as we go ahead and march into this, I believe in this last little part, the key point here, but as we march forward, I thought this cultural sport psychology, the CSP, if you will, I thought it was kind of difficult to read, and I thought there was a lot going on there. It really wasn't of benefit. It's a field of study that examines the interplay between culture and the psychological aspects of sport and athletic performance. So it seeks to understand how cultural values and beliefs influence an athlete's mindset, their behavior, and experiences in sport. So as I talked about in another presentation, you have an athlete standing in front of you, but they have an entire body of work that equates to years of interactions with coaches and their parents and other athletes. And part of that influence that's laid into that process is a cultural aspect, right? And when you have somebody who's in front of you who maybe has some blind spots, has some biases, it takes some work to work with that athlete to help them through the process, to help minimize and eliminate some of those biases. And, whether it's experience in sport or how they grew up or et cetera, the different athletes will respond to culturally diverse environments differently. So you may have different athletes who respond to your group of athletes on your team differently than others. And it's just the nature of how we are as people. But again, as a coach, you have to kind of work to help your athletes resolve that. And I would contest that if you're a coach that hasn't resolved that in yourself, you're going to have some challenges helping your athletes do it. So I would say do the heavy lifting and the self work first, and then help others in that process. All right, signing off.